Today we are joined by Avery Rogers. She is the creator of the podcast Brainstorms, a podcast dedicated to informing teens, parents, educators about the complexities of the developing teenage brain. She is insightful, a great storyteller, and really quite inspirational. We are very happy to have her here today on Inspirational Women in Neuroscience. Avery Rogers, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. So would you mind telling us how old you were when you started Brainstorms, your podcast?
Yeah, so I started Brainstorms in the fall of my senior year of high school. So I was 17 years old when I started that, but got interested in neuroscience a little bit earlier in life. I originally got interested in adolescent neuroscience specifically when I was, I think, about 14 years old. My mom actually gave me a book for Christmas. It was a really, really fascinating read just about the new science of adolescence. Yeah, and a lot of the research in that was very new at the time, which is very cool because all this stuff has been coming out, and even since that book was published, I think there's been a lot of new research in the field. So would encourage people to look at even newer stuff as well. But yeah, the age of opportunity, the new science of adolescence.
That's neat. And I sort of have a similar experience with my mom and how I got interested in neuroscience. She went back to school about a couple of years ago to study neuroscience and psychology. And since then, we've just had so many books in our house about neuroscience. And I think it was Norman Doidge's book that really got me interested in neuroscience.
Yeah.
So I'm
very cool.
Feel on the same page as you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so was there anyone who inspired you along the way or who helped you really get Brainstorm started or kickstart your interest in neuroscience?
Yeah, so as far as the podcast was concerned, I did work somewhat with the dean of student life at my high school. He kind of helped me brainstorm, no pun intended, but brainstorm through the process of creating the podcast and I originally actually wanted to do a series of YouTube videos about adolescent neuroscience, but quickly realized that was going to be really difficult for me with little video experience. So he helped me decide, maybe a podcast is a better medium and think about my kind of goals for the site in terms of what do you want teenagers to take away, what kind of themes do you want to focus on, what kind of style and tone do you want to use. So that was really valuable. And then in terms of neuroscience in general, I think most of my inspiration definitely came from reading. I think someone who really kind of captured my imagination early on was Oliver Sacks, who writes a lot of, I guess, technically psychology books. At the time that he was writing, there was a lot less information about neuroscience, just because a lot of the technology that allows us to view the brain is really new. But Oliver Sacks has written a lot of books. Probably the most famous one is The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, but about some of his psychological patients and the kinds of neurological disorders they experienced and exactly how that manifested in their everyday life. And it really showed me how important neuroscience is on a very everyday level, because a lot of times it can feel kind of abstract, but just understanding that these brain regions we talk about have such a critical impact on our everyday lives and just all of the decisions we're making, all of the things we're perceiving, and how we can finally start to understand how those brain regions affect very, very basic fundamental parts of our perceptions and thoughts.
So true, really. And you said that a teacher at your school helped you sort of identify what goals you had for your podcast and how to most effectively execute those. And I'm just wondering, what were your goals going into it in regard to Brainstorms?
Yeah, for sure. So Brainstorms is kind of an interesting project in that it's very specific to teenage neuroscience, which sounds a little bit maybe too specific, but there's actually a lot of research out there about teenagers in specific, just because the brain undergoes so many changes between the ages of about 12 to 25, and it's the window of really increased neuroplasticity, which means means the brain can change very easily during those years. There's also a lot of maturing going on in different brain regions at different times. So that was the kind of stuff I basically wanted to focus on. And then thinking about the podcast in specific, one of the things we really identified was, what do I want teenagers to be able to use this information for? Because I can tell people, oh, yeah, the brain is very neuroplastic during those years, but how does that have a direct manifestation on the everyday lives of teenagers? So we kind of formulated themes that might have more of an impact on people just living their lives, and tried to figure out how I could use more of a tone and use more of a sort of rhetorical style that would focus on those more everyday manifestations of the information I was using. So, for example, one of the episodes I talked about was habit formation, which is really fascinating, the way that the brain latches onto habits even when you don't have the capacity to remember something consciously. The habit cycle and the habit pathway in the brain retains that sort of subconscious information, which sounds a little bit dry just on the surface maybe, but trying to talk to kids about exactly how you form a habit based on the brain chemistry and based on neurological signaling hopefully helps people in their everyday life actually, if they want to make a habit to exercise more, for instance, using that neuroscience in a very applied and tangible way in terms of trying to do things on a routine, trying to use certain strategies to, use that neuroscience information in your everyday life was really what I was trying to focus on. And that's something he really helped me decide about in terms of what do you want your audience to really take away, and how do you want this to go beyond just the half an hour they spend listening to your episode.
Yeah, that's great. I really appreciate what you said about making sure that your podcasts were like informative and showed how this really, really intriguing neuroscience can manifest in your everyday life. And habits are certainly one of those things that you see, like the neuroscience play out in your life every day. What you learned through your podcast change anything about your life? Like learning about habits, how did that affect your life, I guess? That's what I'm trying to ask.
Yeah. I think really broadly one thing that affected me a lot learning about adolescent neuroscience was just, and it sounds a little bit obscure and unrelated, but I think to have a little bit more compassion for myself and other teenagers, in the sense that our brains are undergoing massive changes during this age period. Teenagers are a lot more sensitive to emotions and to change in emotions, to feelings of maybe social exclusion and things like that, and a lot more likely to make impulsive decisions just based on the brain regions that are mature and immature during the adolescent years. So I think realizing that my brain and all of our brains, for those of us who are adolescents, are in this phase where there's really a lot of kind of insecurity and exploration going on, which is really exciting because we can learn a lot and grow a lot, but also can be really overwhelming because our brains aren't as good maybe at handling strong emotions or difficult situations, are not quite as matured in the parts of our brain that usually regulate that. And so I think one thing I definitely took away was, okay, when I'm going through something difficult, my brain is in a place where that's going to be really intense, particularly during the adolescent years. And when I see other people struggling with different things or maybe making risky or impulsive decisions, to have a little bit of extra compassion for people in this age group. And to realize also that as we get older, those things will become easier with time, and so getting some perspective on that, I think, is one of the really incredible things about the recent research on adolescent neuroscience, and saying there is a reason why teenagers act differently from adults in a lot of ways. And it's not just because they have less life experience, it's because their brain is in this crazy period of transition. And so I think that's one thing that I really took away, among others, yeah.
That's a great thing to take away, having this empathy for for the teenage experience and how it's not like totally just your teenage self. It's really your brain chemistry and what's going on like biologically with brain development. I think that's such an important thing to keep in mind. Sorry, that's no pun intended there. But I really appreciate you saying that. I think more people could have that lesson and learn that as well. I have another question for you about any challenges that you faced during this process of creating your podcast and in your scientific endeavors, and how maybe did you overcome these?
Yeah, so one of the things that was a real struggle at the beginning of the podcast was doing research. I tried to rely as much as possible on academic journal articles, a lot of which were published on like the National Institutes of Health website, which has a really wide collection of free articles about just medicine in general, including neuroscience. And when I first started reading those articles, I mean, I didn't have any sort of background training in neuroscience, so that was really overwhelming to be reading about all these neurotransmitters and other biological chemicals and neural pathways and all of this very esoteric neuroscience information. I was kind of pouring through and feeling totally unprepared to synthesize for a teenage audience, or for any audience for that matter. So that was a definite challenge. And I think over time, the more I read articles, the more I started to notice that I could kind of read the introduction of an academic article, read the conclusion, and get kind of the gist of things, and then go into the meat of the article with a little bit more of an ability to summarize and kind of pull out the big points, and also started getting more familiar with the brain regions people were talking about. So I think overcoming that was really just persevering through the research and trying to expose myself to a lot of different articles, so that I started noticing patterns and kind of learning how to read that kind of information. And then I think a potential other challenge that I had was within the realm of research as well, was kind of trying to select which articles I felt were maybe the most correct, which is a really hard thing to do because different studies come out all the time and sometimes have contradictory results, right? Like one study will say, we saw a big change, like difference, for example, between girls and boys on this task. And other studies will say we saw no difference between girls and boys. And so as a reader, how am I supposed to distinguish which study I want to sort of highlight in my work? And that's something that I tried to do by trying to confirm those studies through maybe like a New York Times piece, because a lot of times the more important or sort of trailblazing research that comes out will be published in other major and more general audience news publications. So trying to see what kind of research was coming out in other newspapers and books, trying to sort of verify that way. Although I will admit it is very difficult, especially since so much of this information is very new, to be 100% sure that what you're reporting in a podcast is true, in the sense that sometimes, studies have small sample sizes, so you might have 20 teenagers in the study, and it might have skewed results for that reason. So that was definitely a challenge, and something that now that I'm in college, I'm still thinking.
Just saying thank you for sharing those tips about your research, and I think that challenge that you faced is something that a lot of people experience, especially when self-directing themselves through this type of learning, because I doubt that you had any prior exposure to neuroscience, say, in school, did you?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, and so I think like learning how to do appropriate research and effective research when self-directing yourself through learning about neuroscience is something that's really challenging and that a lot of people face. So thank you for giving those tips about, I guess, how best to teach yourself neuroscience. Yeah, and I guess perseverance is a key thing with that, as you mentioned. And reading the conclusion and introduction as like a first step in reading a scientific article or journal can be helpful too.
Yeah, for sure. And I think for people just generally interested in learning more about neuroscience, I think there are a lot of books that have come out more recently that are kind of, intended more for a general audience that do draw on a lot of these studies. So I think that could be really valuable too. Just for me creating the podcast, I wanted to go to primary sources as much as possible. But I think people shouldn't feel dissuaded from learning because they feel like they have to read scientific journal articles. So I would just throw that out there as well, that a lot of the books that have come out recently, the Deutsches you mentioned, Age of Opportunity, things like that, can be really valuable sources of information too that help to bridge the scientific research with a more general audience language style.
Yeah, that's really a good point, because I feel like at sometimes there is a huge gap between the general public and, I guess, lay people, and then those who are actually publishing studies and writing in this scientific language and using like huge jargon that most people wouldn't understand. And so I value authors and people like you who make podcasts that are so easy to understand, and you can communicate really scientific information in a way that's digestible, I guess. And I think that bridges the gap between what may seem like really scary and fancy scientific work, and then like being able to apply it to your own life and understand it as a layperson.
Yeah, for sure.
And you mentioned that you're now using those tidbits of information that you learned while doing this like self-direct learning in neuroscience in college now. And so you're at Stanford, correct?
Yes.
And what year are you in?
I'm a freshman this year.
Oh, how's that transition been?
It's been great. I mean, Stanford is it's an intense place, but I really do enjoy the intensity. I actually just started spring break and don't know what to do with myself because I have so little to do. So it's been great. Yeah.
Nice. And do you know what you're going to major in yet?
So I'm planning on majoring in economics with a behavioral focus. So behavioral economics is kind of an interesting field that combines a lot of psychology and actually increasingly neuroscience with sort of the more economic models of decision making.
That's really interesting. What's been some of the more fascinating things that you've learned this year?
Yeah, so right now for economics specifically, I'm still going through the core requirements, which has been not as much behavioral, but just some of the basic economics. I actually took a statistics course this quarter, which can sound dry and a little bit off-putting, but I found it really fascinating, and you realize how important statistics is to all of the research people are doing. You can never say anything for sure in research because you could always, especially biological and social science research, because you could always be sort of seeing the anomaly, but learning how to statistically analyze those things can help you understand how sure you are of how your research being correct and kind of what you can anticipate from, further study. And then another class that was really interesting that I took last quarter was about, it was called The Science of Diverse Communities. It was kind of about the psychology of diversity and how we could do a better job of creating diverse communities in colleges and elsewhere. And my professor actually invented a concept called stereotype threat, which is where stereotypes about different groups, if you're a member of that group and that stereotype sort of in your mind, it will cause you to perform differently, just subconsciously, which is a really crazy advance in psychological study. So it was really cool to learn from him about the ways in which stereotypes or sort of generalizations about your own identity affect your performance, regardless of whether or not people bring up that identity consciously to you.
Yeah, I was reading about that. It's absolutely insane how just even while taking a standardized test, if you're reminded that you're female or if you're reminded that you are African American, which both unfortunately have stereotypes of being, I don't want to say, I guess, lesser than, say, a white male, then you're more likely to perform poorly on that test.
Yeah, it's crazy. And it was very cool to hear directly from the guy who actually pioneered a lot of this research. He did a lot of those standardized testing studies and has been really involved in thinking about how we can fix those kinds of things. So,
wow.
His name is Claude Steele, actually, and he wrote a book called Whistling Vivaldi, if anyone is curious about the stuff he's working on.
Yeah, that's great. And you mentioned that he was recommending ways to correct that. Would you mind sharing with us what those ways were that he was talking about?
Yeah, and I think he would preface this by saying it's a really difficult issue and one that he doesn't have any solid answer for. But one thing that he emphasized a lot was that having a mentor, and even especially a mentor who shares some of your identity traits, who shows you that they believe in you personally and who you have a personal relationship, can be really helpful for people who feel like their identity is threatened in a certain environment. So if it's academic, maybe having a specific professor who really shows a belief and interest in you. If it's maybe sports, having a coach, something like that can really make a difference because you feel maybe more legitimated in that space. And then another thing that he talked about a lot was having sort of clear and explicit structure to an academic program can help people who maybe come from backgrounds without as much sort of academic training to really succeed and to stay on track. So those were two things he mentioned. But again, it's very difficult to maybe parse those things.
It's such a complex problem. It's hard to say this is the one true solid solution to overcoming stereotypes and their effects. But I appreciate you sharing that bit of information. And when you're talking about mentors, it made me wonder, did you have any I guess, mentors or scientific role models who have really helped propel your endeavors in this field of social behavior and neuroscience?
Yeah, so I think definitely people I've read, I mentioned Oliver Sacks, and then Lawrence Steinberg was the author of Age of Opportunity. So I think a lot of authors I read definitely were role models in the sense that they were pioneering in the field. And then in terms of personal mentors, I definitely got a lot of help from the teacher at my school who was helping me work on the podcast. And I think having him really be a source of accountability and also of faith in my project was really valuable during that time. And then more broadly, I think my math teacher when I was a sophomore in high school really showed a lot of belief in this is not as much related to neuroscience, but I think salient to the idea of, especially women getting into more STEM-related fields, given that math is something that oftentimes women are thought to be or stereotyped to be less successful at. I had a math teacher in sophomore year who really took an interest in me and challenged me and believed a lot in me and was very encouraging of my math ability. And that was really, really helpful for me. I was somewhat advanced in math in high school, but a little bit intimidated by being around some older kids in classes and not necessarily knowing if I could succeed. And so that experience was really valuable, and she definitely affected my academic career a lot. And so I would say that especially for people who are interested in the Synapse project and things like that, I think having one of those mentors in a STEM field can be really, really valuable, and someone who can affirm that you belong in that field and that you can succeed in that field can be really, really useful and just very moralizing.
Yeah, and your math teacher, I assume she must be really, really proud of you, and just seeing where you are now and what you've done.
Thank you.
Yeah. Do you have any more advice for aspiring scientists? I mean, you've shared great bits of wisdom and information with us, but I'm wondering if you have any last words of advice for girls who may look up to you and say, wow, that's something I want to be when I'm older. Do you have any advice for them?
Yeah, I guess I would say don't be intimidated about trying to start a project. When I was growing up, I mean, it was super intimidating to do original research, and you feel like there are all those people out there. I don't know, you hear about students who are already conducting their own research in neuroscience, and what does that even mean? And I don't even know anything about the brain. How could I possibly get there, especially at such a young age? But I would say, yes, there are people out there maybe doing original research, but you don't have to be involved in a lab to do really interesting things around neuroscience or any field. I think it's really super valuable, obviously, since I did the podcast, to bring information to other people. So I think that's a really attainable way to try to get involved in the science and learn more about the science without feeling that daunting pressure to do something original. Because most of the people doing original research have PhDs, and we're not there yet. So there's no pressure to feel like I can't be a member of the scientific community unless I'm conducting my own experiments, for example. And then I think another thing people should keep in mind is that, I think in the world of today, a lot of times we feel like we have to go and change the whole world and be a media sensation and have a really wide influence. And through my experience with brainstorms, I actually realized that having an influence on smaller communities was actually really meaningful for me. I taught a few health classes at some local high schools in conjunction with the research I was doing. And just talking to those groups of students and really engaging with them was probably the most meaningful part of my work, even though it wasn't a huge audience. Just really talking to them and trying to help them understand and sort of contextualize the teenage experience was really valuable for me and really showed me that what I was doing mattered to some group of students. So I would say to anyone out there, use your high school as a place to kind of make change in the world. Obviously, shoot for the stars as well, but I think you can do a lot of change among your own community if you could try to bring, whatever field you're passionate to for them, see if you can teach a class or try to get a workshop or a guest speaker. Anything like that, I think, can really have a big impact and be really intrinsically meaningful, even if it doesn't feel maybe as wide. So those are the things I would say in terms of getting involved in science and really trying to make an impact through the scientific field.
Well, thank you so much for being with us here today and for sharing and giving some really wonderful advice. I would completely like to echo what you said about really valuing any impact, and it doesn't have to be grand, huge scale. You change the world, which would be amazing, but also just appreciating the small communities you can impact, and as you've done. So I really, really thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today at the Synapse Project. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much.